Imagine selling your house, not for cash, not for gold, but for a single flower bulb. Not a garden full of flowers, not even a bouquet. Just one bulb. One that hasn't even bloomed yet. Sound insane? Well, in 1637, this wasn't just happening in the Netherlands. It was the hottest investment opportunity in the country. Welcome back to the channel. Today we're diving into one of the most bizarre economic events in human history. The Dutch Tulip Mania of 1637, widely considered the world's first recorded economic bubble. This is a story about how an exotic flower from the Ottoman Empire became more valuable than real estate, how ordinary people bet their entire fortunes on underground bulbs, and how it all came crashing down in a matter of days. By the end of this video, you'll see how Tulip Mania set the template for every financial bubble that followed. So let's dive in. To understand why the Dutch went crazy for tulips, we need to understand the context of 17th century Netherlands. The early 1600s marked the beginning of what historians call the Dutch Golden Age. The Netherlands had recently won independence from Spain after decades of brutal warfare. But more importantly, they were becoming the economic powerhouse of Europe. The Dutch East India Company, established in 1602, was making merchants incredibly wealthy through trade with Asia. Dutch ships dominated global commerce, bringing back spices, silks, porcelain, and other exotic goods from the Far East. Amsterdam was rapidly becoming the financial capital of Europe, and the Dutch were developing some of the world's first sophisticated financial instruments. This wasn't just prosperity, this was unprecedented wealth. The Netherlands had the highest per capita income in the world during this period. Successful merchants had money to spend, and they were looking for ways to display their newfound wealth. But here's the thing about Dutch society at the time. They were also deeply Protestant, with Calvinist values that emphasized modesty and frowned upon ostentatious displays of wealth. You couldn't just build a golden palace or wear excessive jewelry without facing social criticism. So the wealthy needed something that was expensive, rare, and beautiful, but also discreet and refined. Something that showed sophistication without being vulgar. That's where the tulip came in. Tulips aren't native to Europe. They originated in the mountainous regions of Central Asia and had been cultivated for centuries in the Ottoman Empire, where they were a symbol of paradise and perfection. The introduction of tulips to Western Europe is generally attributed to Ogier de Busbecq, the ambassador of the Holy Roman Emperor to the Ottoman Sultan, who sent the first tulip bulbs and seeds to Vienna in 1554. But the real father of the Dutch tulip industry was a botanist named Carolus Clusius. In the 1590s, Clusius brought tulips to the Netherlands and began studying them scientifically. He established a botanical garden in Leiden and carefully cultivated various tulip varieties. At first, tulips were purely the domain of wealthy collectors and botanical enthusiasts. They were exotic, beautiful, and orderly in their growth, perfect for the Dutch aesthetic. A single tulip bulb could cost as much as a cow, which was already expensive. But these were stable, reasonable prices for a luxury item. By the early 1630s, tulips had become a fixture in the gardens of the Dutch elite. But what happened next transformed them from expensive ornamental flowers into objects of wild financial speculation. And it all had to do with a mysterious phenomenon that no one could explain or control. The most valuable tulips weren't the solid-colored ones. The real prizes were called broken tulips, bulbs that produced flowers with dramatic streaks, flames, and feathery patterns of contrasting colors against a paler background. A solid red tulip might be nice, but a tulip with vivid crimson flames dramatically streaking across a pure white background? That was extraordinary. That was art. That was worth a fortune. The problem was that no one in the 17th century understood what caused these breaks. Growers desperately tried everything to reproduce the effect. Some scattered pigmented powder on the soil, hoping the bulbs would absorb the colors. Others tried to physically fuse bulbs of different colors together. Some used bizarre fertilizers, pigeon dung, plaster from old walls, anything they thought might trigger the transformation. But the breaks seemed random. You could plant 100 bulbs and maybe, just maybe, one would break into a spectacular multicolored variety. It was like winning the lottery. Here's what we know now that they didn't know then. The broken tulips were actually infected with a virus. The tulip-breaking virus, carried by aphids, disrupts the pigmentation in the petals, creating those striking patterns. But in the 1630s, this was pure mystery. The rarest varieties seemed to be gifts from God, products of secret knowledge, or just incredible luck. And nothing drives up prices faster than scarcity, combined with unpredictability. Among all the broken tulips, one variety stood above all others: the Semper Augustus. The Semper Augustus was considered the most beautiful tulip in the world. Its petals displayed deep crimson flames dramatically streaking across a white background, with perfect symmetry and stark contrast. Artists captured it in still-life paintings. It appeared in detailed catalogues printed with the latest technology. But what made the Semper Augustus truly special was its extreme scarcity. At one point, it was said that only 12 bulbs of this variety existed in the entire world. One man, Adrian Pauw, a powerful Dutch official and director of the Dutch East India Company, owned almost all of them. He kept them in his elaborate garden, which featured a mirrored gazebo that multiplied the tulip's reflections, creating a dazzling display of wealth and beauty. And he refused to sell. This drove the price to astronomical levels. Historical sources show that at the height of Tulip Mania, a single Semper Augustus bulb was worth between 5,000 and 10,000 guilders, enough money to buy one of the finest canal-side houses in Amsterdam, complete with a coach house and an 80-foot garden. To put this in modern terms, that's somewhere between $200,000 and $750,000 for a single flower bulb. The tragic irony? The very virus that made the Semper Augustus so beautiful was also slowly killing it. The tulip-breaking virus weakens the bulbs, making them harder to propagate, and eventually causing them to go extinct. Today, the Semper Augustus exists only in paintings. Despite modern attempts to recreate its appearance, the original variety is gone forever. But in the mid-1630s, none of this mattered. People weren't thinking about plant biology or long-term sustainability. They were thinking about getting rich. Before 1633, the tulip trade was restricted mainly to professional growers and botanical experts. Prices were high, but relatively stable. Bulbs changed hands during the summer months, when they could be safely dug up and transferred. But then, something changed. By 1634, tulip trading was spreading beyond the professional horticultural community. Regular merchants started getting involved, then artisans, then shopkeepers. The success stories were impossible to ignore. Someone would buy a bulb, hold it for a few months, and sell it for double or triple what they paid. Here's where things got really interesting. The market shifted from trading actual bulbs to trading contracts for future bulbs. Remember, tulip bulbs can only be safely removed from the ground during the summer. but people wanted to trade year-round. So they started trading promissory notes, essentially futures contracts, in the middle of winter for bulbs that were still underground. You weren't buying the tulip itself. You were buying the promise of a tulip that would be delivered months later. And these contracts could be bought and sold multiple times before the bulb ever left the ground. At the peak of the mania, contracts were changing hands up to 10 times in a single day. The trading moved from formal exchanges to taverns. Think about that for a moment. The Dutch invented the world's first documented futures market, and they were running it out of pubs. These weren't stock exchanges with regulations and oversight. These were alcohol-fueled gambling sessions where ordinary people were betting their life savings on flowers they'd never seen, that hadn't even bloomed yet, that were still buried in the frozen ground. The barrier to entry was incredibly low. You didn't need the full price up front. You could put down a small deposit, sometimes as little as 2.5%, and promise to pay the rest when the bulb was delivered in summer. This created massive leverage. People could control huge positions with very little money down. By 1636, tulip mania had swept through Holland. It seemed like everyone was talking about tulips, trading tulips, or at least thinking about getting into the tulip market. The prices reached truly absurd levels. Historical records document some extraordinary transactions. One particularly well-documented trade showed a single viceroy tulip bulb being exchanged for 2 loads of wheat, 4 loads of rye, 4 fat oxen, 8 fat pigs, 12 fat sheep, 2 hogsheads of wine, 4 barrels of beer, 2 barrels of butter, 1,000 pounds of cheese, a complete bed, a suit of clothes, and a silver drinking cup. The total value? About 2,500 florins, roughly equivalent to $125,000 in today's money. For one bulb. An auction in Alkmaar in February 1637 saw tulips selling for extraordinary prices. The Admirael van Enkhuizen sold for 5,200 guilders. The Switzer experienced a 12-fold price increase in just a few months. Now, we need to be careful here with the historical record. Much of what we know about tulip mania comes from a satirical pamphlet called Dialogues between Vermont and Geiergoed, literally True Mouth and Greedy Goods, published right after the crash. This was propaganda designed to mock the speculators, and as satire, it definitely exaggerated some details. Modern historians like Anne Goldgar have shown that tulip mania probably wasn't quite as widespread as the popular narrative suggests. It wasn't literally everyone from aristocrats to chimney sweeps. The actual traders were mostly successful merchants and skilled artisans, people who could afford to speculate in luxury goods. Only about 37 people are documented as paying more than 300 guilders for a bulb, the equivalent of a skilled craftsman's annual salary. But here's what's undeniable. Prices did surge dramatically, reaching levels that had no connection to the intrinsic value of the flowers. People were buying not because they wanted tulips, but because they expected to sell them to someone else for even more money. This is the classic definition of a speculative bubble. And there's a term in economics for this kind of thinking: the greater fool theory. You might be a fool for paying too much, but as long as there's a greater fool willing to pay even more, you'll make money. Until there isn't. The collapse came suddenly and completely. On the first week of February 1637, in the city of Haarlem, a routine tulip auction was held. But something unprecedented happened. the buyers didn't show up. The auctioneer offered bulbs for sale, no bids. He lowered the price. Still no bids. He lowered it again. Nothing. The tulip market, which had been roaring with activity just days before, had simply frozen. Some historians speculate that an outbreak of plague may have spooked buyers. Others point to the simple fact that bulb sprouts were beginning to emerge from the frozen ground, revealing just how many bulbs had actually been planted during the mania. With quantity no longer hidden underground, scarcity evaporated. The crash spread from Haarlem across the Netherlands with devastating speed. By February 9, 1637, the tulip market had essentially ceased to exist. Prices didn't just fall, they collapsed completely. Bulbs that had been worth thousands of guilders days earlier couldn't find buyers at any price. Historian Mike Dash notes that the market for tulips simply ceased to exist. The economist Earl Thompson calculated that the annualized rate of price decline was 99.999%, essentially instant vaporization of value. The speculators who had bought on margin were now facing financial disaster. They owed huge sums for bulbs that were now worthless. Contracts that had seemed like tickets to wealth were now crushing debts. On February 23rd, tulip growers proposed to the courts that buyers be allowed to cancel contracts by paying just 10% of the agreed price. After lengthy deliberations, the courts essentially washed their hands of the whole mess, ruling that disputes should be handled locally and that most tulip contracts weren't legally enforceable. In the end, the vast majority of contracts were simply never honored. So what were the consequences of tulip mania? This is where the historical record gets interesting. For generations, the popular narrative, established by Charles Mackay in his 1841 book, Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds, was that tulip mania brought economic devastation to the Netherlands. Mackay claimed that thousands of families were ruined, estates were destroyed, and Dutch commerce suffered a severe shock. But modern economic historians have questioned this narrative. The research of Anne Goldgar and other scholars suggests that while individual speculators certainly lost money, tulip mania didn't actually damage the broader Dutch economy. Remember, this was still the Dutch Golden Age. The Netherlands continued to be the richest country in Europe, with the highest per capita income in the world. The Dutch East India Company continued to dominate global trade. Amsterdam remained the financial capital of Europe. The tulip bubble was actually quite small in economic terms. It involved maybe a few thousand people total out of a population of 2 million. Most of the Netherlands just kept on working, trading, and prospering. What did have lasting impact was the cultural and moral reaction. Dutch society was deeply shocked that something as simple as a flower bulb could cause such irrational speculation. Moralistic pamphlets and sermons condemned the greed and folly of the tulip traders. The court's decision to essentially nullify most tulip contracts set an important precedent. But it also showed that society was more interested in moving on than in punishing speculators. The tulip trade itself continued. The Netherlands remains the world's largest tulip producer today. But it returned to being a normal agricultural commodity, rather than a vehicle for wild speculation. So what can we learn from tulip mania nearly 400 years later? First, tulip mania established the template for every economic bubble that followed. The pattern is remarkably consistent. Stage 1. Displacement. Something new and exciting appears. In this case, exotic tulips from the east. In other bubbles, it might be railway stocks, internet companies, or cryptocurrency. Stage 2. Boom. Early adopters make money, attracting more participants. Prices rise, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy as rising prices attract more buyers. Stage 3. Euphoria. The belief takes hold that this time is different and that prices will keep rising forever. Normal valuation methods are abandoned. In 1637, people convinced themselves that wealthy collectors worldwide would always pay premium prices for tulips. Stage 4. Profit-taking. Some smart or lucky participants start selling. This is often invisible at first. Stage 5. Panic. Something triggers a realization that prices are unsustainable. Buyers disappear. Sellers panic. The market crashes. This pattern has repeated throughout history. The South Sea bubble of 1720, the railway mania of the 1840s, the stock market crash of 1929, the dot-com bubble of 2000, the housing bubble of 2008, the cryptocurrency volatility of recent years. Second, leverage amplifies both gains and losses. The ability to buy tulips with small down payments meant people could speculate with money they didn't have. When prices were rising, this created enormous paper profits. When prices fell, it created crushing debts. We saw the same dynamic with mortgage derivatives in 2008. Third, bubbles often involve hard-to-value assets. How much is a unique tulip bulb worth? How much is a share in a company with no profits but tremendous growth potential? When there's no clear intrinsic value, speculation can detach prices from reality. Fourth, social proof is powerful. When your neighbors are getting rich from tulips, you feel foolish sitting it out. The fear of missing out is a powerful psychological force that drives bubble behavior. Finally, markets can remain irrational longer than you can remain solvent. Some people in 1636 probably recognized that tulip prices were absurd. But if you sold too early, you missed out on massive gains. Timing the peak is nearly impossible. Today, you can visit the Netherlands during tulip season and see millions of flowers stretching across the landscape in stunning ribbons of color. The Dutch still dominate the global tulip trade, producing billions of bulbs annually. But none of them will cost you a house. The story of tulip mania has endured for nearly 4 centuries because it captures something fundamental about human nature: our tendency toward greed, speculation, and irrational exuberance when we think we've found a shortcut to wealth. The flowers that drove men to madness in 1637 are the same flowers that bloom peacefully in gardens around the world today. The only difference is our perspective. Every bubble feels different when you're in it. Every new technology, every new asset class seems revolutionary. Seems like it will change everything. Seems like this time really is different. But as the Dutch learned in 1637, sometimes a flower is just a flower. And sometimes, what goes up must come down. What do you think? Was tulip mania an actual economic crisis? Or just a moral panic exaggerated by history? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this deep dive into economic history, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more content exploring the fascinating stories behind the financial world we live in today. Until next time, stay curious. And whatever you do, don't mortgage your house for flowers.